Good afternoon. Welcome to the third installment of this year's Hard Conversation series. My name is Sarah Craig, and I am the Vice President of Development and Communications for Metro Dallas Homeless Alliance, MDHA, and we are so glad that you could join us today. We will continue today to interrogate the question, who deserves a shot at the American dream? This year's series is sponsored by Ashford Hospitality Trust. Thank you so much. We're also grateful for our additional sponsors. Charles Schwab Bank is a silver sponsor, and Northway Christian Church is also a sponsor. Thank you to all three of you. We could not continue these important and crucial conversations without you. So we appreciate your support. As we get started, I just wanted to let you know we'll be using the Q&A feature throughout this conversation. So in the bottom of your menu, the Q&A button is toward the center. So if you have a question throughout our conversation, please put that question there and we will answer as many as we can at the end of our time here together. This year, we have highlighted how as a nation, our policies and practices have intentionally and explicitly excluded certain people from attaining what many consider the American dream. Our series has focused on that impact in the housing and homelessness space. Specifically. In our first installment, we explored how the conscious exclusion of Black people and other persons of color from housing specifically caused many of the problems that we see today. In our second installment, we discussed the book, Homelessness Is a Housing Problem. We chatted with the authors and we were able to unpack common misconceptions about homelessness and showcase the evidence that proves to us that yes, homelessness is a housing problem. Today, we are excited to discuss another important book, In the Midst of Plenty, Homelessness and What to Do About It, with its authors. Nan Roman, who recently retired as the CEO of the National Alliance to End Homelessness, writes in the book's foreword, the knowledgeable and thoughtful authors of this book, two brilliant women who know as much as anyone in the country about the nature of homelessness and its solutions, have done a great service by taking us on a journey through the history of homelessness, how our responses have changed, and how we can end it. At this time, I'd like to welcome Beth and Jill to join me. Hi, ladies. Thank you. Mary Beth Shin serves as the Cornelius Vanderbilt Chair in the Department of Human and Organizational Development at Vanderbilt University. She holds a PhD from the University of Michigan. She also serves on Nashville's Continuum of Care and on the Research Advisory Board for the National Alliance to End Homelessness. We also have with us Jill Kaduri, is the Principal Associate, Social and Economic Policy at Abt Associates, where she is one of the most senior fellows. She holds a PhD from Johns Hopkins University. Previously, she directed the Division of Policy Development in the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development's Office of Policy Development and Research. Thank you, ladies, for joining us. Thank you for not only writing this book, but for having a conversation with us today. We're grateful to also have a good friend of MDHA who is going to moderate this conversation for us today. Ashley, would you join me at this time? Thank you. Ashley Brundage is the Executive Director of Housing Stability and Senior Vice President of Community Impact at United Way of Metropolitan Dallas. She holds an MSSW from the University of Texas at Arlington. She has been she's been an MDHA volunteer since 2010 and was key to founding the MDHA Flex Fund, which has helped many individuals to end their homelessness here in Dallas and Collin County. And for several months last year, she served as MDHA's co-interim CEO. She currently serves as the board chair of our Continuum of Care here in Dallas and Collin counties. Thank you, Ashley, just for your commitment to this work and for hosting this conversation for us today.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Sarah. I'm excited to be able to moderate another hard conversation, especially with these two women here who are famous across the country for their work in this space. We have quite a few colleagues that are excited to hear from you all today. So we are going to dive right in if that's good with y'all. Hopefully everybody had a chance to read the book or pick it up and start to read it at least. And, you know, you could have called the book Homelessness and What to Do About It. Instead, you made a very deliberate choice, titling it In the Midst of Plenty. This feels like a very intentional effort on your part to provide some context around housing and homelessness in the United States. Can you talk to us a little bit about what your title is emphasizing?
So thanks so much for having us. I think the core argument in the book is that we know how to end homelessness. The research shows us the way. It's a question of resources, and we have those resources if we choose to devote them. And so In the Midst of Plenty suggests, even though many people may not feel that they personally are experiencing a lot of plenty right now, that the country has the resources and we can end this problem if we pay attention to the research and we devote the resources.
Yes, so perfect. I've been saying that forever. Everybody asks me why I got into this space. I'm like, because it's easily solvable if we just put the resources behind it, right? So both of you in your introduction and then Nan in the foreword remind us that homelessness that we see today is actually a recent phenomenon in our country's history. Why is it important to keep reminding ourselves of this?
Well, it's because that helps us understand that contemporary homelessness, as that began in the 1980s, is basically a housing problem. As your earlier seminar also pointed out, and we will reemphasize throughout what we say today. An earlier type of homelessness mainly affected single men who were disconnected from families and could no longer do their physically demanding jobs in construction or forestry. And another earlier wave of homelessness was the millions of people who were out of work in intense cities during the Great Depression. But the contemporary homelessness, the homelessness that began in the 1980s, is a crisis of housing affordability for the poorest people. So it affects more different types of people, including families with children and people who are still working but at low wage jobs.
Thank you. So in the book, your chapters are divvied up pretty much by questions, right? So who becomes homeless? Why do they become homeless? How do they become homeless? And how do we prevent that homelessness? So we've kind of structured the conversation today around those questions. So starting with that first question, who becomes homeless? When you talk about who does become homeless, what does your average homeless person look like? You say it's important to look not at only how many people are experiencing homelessness, but now or even over the course of the year, but over the course of a lifetime. Why do you raise that up? Why is that important?
For two reasons. One is that homelessness for most people is temporary. So many more people pass through homelessness than are homeless on any given night. And the most widely quoted statistic about homelessness is the point in time count on a single night in January. And upwards of 500,000 people are homeless on a single night. And that feels like a kind of small problem. But over 7 times that many people are homeless over the course of a year, just thinking about people who use shelters, never mind the folks who are out of doors and never come into a shelter. And back in 1990, early in this epidemic of homelessness, there was a telephone survey Bruce Link did of people living in normal dwellings, no prisons, no homeless shelters, no barracks. And as sort of a throwaway question, he asked, well, have you ever been homeless? 14% of people said yes, 14% of adults in America. And so then there were some follow-up questions to say, well, was it literal homelessness? And being in a place not fit for human habitation? And 7% of people said yes to that. So it's a much bigger problem of homelessness than many people realize. And if you add housing instability and doubling up on top of that, it's even larger.
Yeah, that's right. We often talk about how hard it is to find those homeless families experiencing homelessness because of that doubling up piece, right? Because they're hidden. And that kind of leads us into the next question. One of the most striking statistics in your book is the most common age at which people use shelters. Can you remind us what that age is and what the implications are of that fact?
So if we were all in person, I'd ask folks to guess. But the answer is infancy. the age at which you're most likely to be in a shelter, okay, that's a little different from being homeless, but the age at which you're most likely to sleep in a homeless shelter is below the age of 1. And that, I think, reinforces that it's really an economic problem. It's a housing problem. Babies outgrow their clothes every time you turn around, but more importantly, they take a parent out of the workforce, so they require the parent to pay for somebody to look after them. And those costs of childcare on top of the costs of housing are often more than poor families can manage.
Yeah. You write that, and you mentioned this a minute ago too, that people who use shelters are only doing it briefly and only once. What does that tell us about the population experiencing homelessness?
Well, I think what that tells us is that sheltered homelessness and the large and very expensive and not very attractive shelter system that we've created can be reduced dramatically by a stronger social safety net that keeps people from having the crisis that tips them into going into a shelter. And also that even without a stronger safety net, programs that divert people from entering shelters can be effective at a pretty low cost.
Mm-hmm. Because really it's just that one incident that is potentially leading most people into homelessness, and that could be quickly solved or resolved with the resources behind it.
And so the kind of diversion programs that now often are called problem solving can be really effective in helping us to prevent a lot of sheltered homelessness and downsize the shelter system. Right. Which I know is much bigger in some parts of the country than it is in others, but I think everybody would like to see fewer shelters and more of a focus on either keeping people from entering shelters in the first place or having them leave shelters as quickly as possible.
Right, and you guys you all went deep into some of that prevention work, and we're going to talk about that in a minute too. But let's talk more about why people fall into homelessness beyond just kind of that one-time incident. You know, I often hear people who are really not in this homelessness space, but around it, talking about how they always feel like people are homeless because they have mental health illness or they've got a substance abuse addiction. But you state that distress and substance abuse, like homelessness itself, are not permanent traits, but instead they're states that can be influenced by environmental circumstances. I think, unfortunately, our general population doesn't always fully understand what that means and how a person can end up on the streets. Most, like I said, most assume it's a failure of that individual, something that they did that caused them to become homeless. So can you talk about what you all see are the actual causes of somebody experiencing homelessness?
Well, let me take the first stab at that.
Okay.
You know, we spend a lot of time in the book debunking the idea that the causes of homelessness are related to individuals or the attributes of individuals, the permanent attributes of individuals. And instead, we look at homelessness as a systems failure. It's a systems failure in part because of the very broad income distribution we have in the United States. Most people who experience homelessness have poverty level incomes, and usually they're living in deep poverty, which means that they have only half the income of the federal policy line. Only a small portion of people with such low incomes experience homelessness in any particular year, although Beth has pointed out that if you look over a longer period of time, they're much more likely to do so at some point. So what tips people into homelessness in any particular year? It's a crisis, such as losing a job, losing the housing that somebody else was providing for them. So for example, for some interviews that we did with people with lived experience, we found often somebody was living with a relative and the relative died, and they didn't inherit the house, and therefore they didn't have any place to live anymore, and they didn't have other family members to turn to. And Beth will elaborate, I think, on why on why certain people are more vulnerable to this kind of crisis. So the person in crisis enters a shelter, or if no shelter bed is available or the shelters are too unattractive, they start sleeping outside.
So you talk about the individual characteristics that we find common to those experiencing homelessness are really the result of, and I really love the term that y'all use, the policies of social exclusion. Can you describe for us what that means and how that results in homelessness?
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned earlier the issue of mental illness, and many people say, oh, they're homeless because they're mentally ill. But why should the penalty for mental illness be homelessness? Right? The reason is that our disability payments are too low for people to afford the rent. And similarly, African Americans and Native Americans are much higher risk of homelessness than people of other races. And that dates back to the issues of social exclusion, of redlining that you talked about in your first seminar, where African Americans weren't able to accumulate wealth in the same way that white Americans were. And for poor people, most wealth is tied up in housing. So that means that they didn't have the housing resources that white people had. But there's also ongoing discrimination in housing, discrimination in employment. And we show this in experiments. So if you send out resumes that have names like Lakeisha and Jamal versus names like Emily and Greg, Lakeisha and Jamal get fewer callbacks than Emily and Greg. And the penalty for having a Black sounding name is equivalent to 8 years of experience. So the kinds of social exclusion, and we could call it racism, but it's the same things go on in the case of folks with mental illness. There's discrimination in employment, there's discrimination in housing, there's the inability to accumulate wealth. In both cases, there's higher levels of incarceration. So the same kinds of processes exclude people and make them more vulnerable. For young people, it's often LGBTQ, sexual orientation, and the people are excluding maybe their families.
Yeah. I think we definitely need to call it racism, but you're right, it's broader than that too when you're looking at the mental health and the gender orientation, sexual orientation. Talk to me about the analogy that you use around musical chairs and how that should inform our policy making, because that was a cool analogy in your book.
So we put that analogy in the book to illustrate scarcity. In particular, the scarcity of rent subsidies that make housing affordable. It's not that the housing stock doesn't grow. It does grow every year. New units are built, and then more new units then are abandoned. So we have a growing housing stock. But little or none of the additional housing that gets built is available to people who need it to avoid experiencing homelessness. Unless we can expand the pool of rent subsidies that are available to people with extremely low incomes, there is going to be a scarcity of affordable housing. So that's what the musical chairs analogy was all about.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. So let's transition to how we end homelessness. You both were on the ground floor of researching into Housing First. So tell us, what is Housing First and why does it work?
Mm-hmm. So the original form of Housing First was for folks with serious mental illnesses and co-occurring substance use disorders. There's a program called Pathways to Housing in New York. And instead of the dominant model at the time of trying to help people overcome their problems in order to be ready for housing, Samson Barris, the leader of that approach, simply put people in apartments with private landlords directly from the street, one day on the street, the next day in housing, but without any prerequisites for sobriety or participation in treatment, with wraparound services that were only voluntary. because services work a whole lot better if people choose them than if you foist them on folks. And so the services would be mental health and substance services, but medical services and vocational services and recreational services to help people get a sense of community. And that works for 85% or so of folks with serious mental illnesses and substance problems. Other groups need less. So for families, Jill and I were involved with a study where simply giving families access to housing vouchers that make housing affordable, that hold their housing expenses to 30% of their income, not only ended homelessness, but had radiating benefits for other aspects of family life. Families could put their lives back together if they had affordable housing.
So you're telling me that housing works, housing ends homelessness.
Mm-hmm.
I think you made it very clear in your book as well. Sorry, Jill, go ahead.
Well, I mean, back for a moment to the causes of homelessness. What we show in the book is that, there's a lot of really good evidence that the reason that we're in a crisis of homelessness is because housing is not affordable. And that comes from the timing of when the current epidemic of homelessness began. It began at the time when there was a dramatic shift in the ratio between housing costs and incomes. And that happened in the late 70s. And guess what happened in the early 80s? Modern homelessness came along. And then we also show that the distribution of high rates of homelessness across the country is very much associated with housing costs. The metropolitan areas that have the highest housing costs are also the places that have the highest rates of homelessness. And then finally, back to the point that Beth was just making, we learned, indisputably from this study called the Family Options Study, that if you give people a long-term housing subsidy, we don't call it a permanent housing subsidy because people usually, families in particular, don't use that subsidy for the rest of their lives. They use it for a few years. And we were absolutely astonished in that study to discover just how high the rates of being able to use those subsidies were for people who were coming out of shelter.
Right, because you're helping them stabilize for those few years that they can then grow their income and afford their own place eventually.
Or an important point that Beth would make is that you get them over the period when their kids are young enough that they have a hard time growing their income, and get them to the point where the school system takes over and provides free childcare. Unfortunately, we don't have a strong childcare system in the U.S.
Right.
So,
I remember that pay raise I got when my kids were done with daycare. It's lovely. So you talk a little bit about what's being done in Finland and the model that they have used to practically end homelessness in their country. What learnings can we bring back here to the United States from that would help inform some of the work that needs to happen here?
So Finland has really solved the problem. And there are a number of European countries that have made housing first their priority. And Finland has probably gone further than anyone else. And they've put the resources in to create a variety of housing options for people. And they have driven housing down. Partly they have done it simply by applying principles of housing first. Partly they've done it by keeping at it over a period of years, by analyzing how things are going and how they need to tweak what they're doing to try to make it better. So it's been a continual learning process and an evolution, but housing first has really been the center of it.
Is Finland, are they a wealthier country than the United States?
No, not on average. They are not a wealthier country. They have less wealth than we do per capita.
So we could put the resources we need as a nation behind this issue to help.
Absolutely.
So they mentioned it earlier, I'm sure you caught it, but I chair our Continuum of Care Board of Directors and was excited to read your research about homelessness response systems. What are the advantages that you talk through of a more efficient and effective homelessness response system? And then what are the limitations?
Well, my colleagues and I at Apt Associates spend a lot of time thinking about that. Thinking about transformation of systems and how the homeless services system can be made more effective. And of course, one of the things that I'm sure everybody in this meeting knows about is the coordinated entry systems that have been developed to make the system more effective and more efficient. And coordinated entry tries to do that by making sure that the most expensive and intensive programs such as permanent supportive housing are used by the people who really need them. I mean, I've done some work in Los Angeles along with my colleagues, and there's been a huge effort over the past decade to reorient permanent supportive housing to make sure that it is actually going to the people who need it the most. That was not an easy thing to do, especially in a large place like Los Angeles. But we also point out that in the book that people prioritize for placements by the coordinated entry system often wait a very long time to get permanent supportive housing or a very long time to get a rent subsidy without services if that's all they actually need. So again, it's a matter of scarcity. It's a matter of insufficient resources being devoted to the systems. PSH can be either project-based or tenant-based. I think that's an important thing to remember, but most communities don't have enough of either type. And they don't have big enough allocations of housing choice vouchers to make prioritization for a long-term subsidy meaningful. In the family options study, we found that when those subsidies are offered to people, they will be able to use them. And we also did some work that we did recently in Los Angeles showed that even in a really expensive and tight housing market like Los Angeles, and that's a place where the housing authorities have really strong preference systems for people experiencing homelessness, and a really remarkable portion of all the people who were issued housing vouchers in Los Angeles were able to use them. People who were using the vouchers to leave homelessness actually used them at a higher rate than other people. Served by the Los Angeles housing authorities, but they're just not enough. Most housing authorities maybe not quite as at the same rate in other parts of the country. I don't know about the Dallas housing authorities or how extensive their preferences for people experiencing homelessness are. But in any case, there're just not enough vouchers to make at this point to support large enough allocations to help people leave homelessness. Now, we also point out in the, you were talking about pros and cons of having a more efficient system, and the coordinated entry is a good example of that. We point out that the VI SPDAT is really flawed as a prioritization tool. And I know there are a lot of efforts going on across the country and perhaps in your community as well to rethink how the prioritization tools work. We also wrote the book before the emerging evidence that we now have that prioritization using a tool like VI SPDAT can exacerbate the disproportionate rates of continued homelessness among Black, Indigenous, and people of color.
Interesting. What I was going to ask a question now. I totally forgot. What do you think is leading to in LA the higher usage of vouchers by those experiencing homelessness versus the other clients they're serving?
Yeah, and I saw somebody in the chat talking about emergency housing vouchers and and we can return and talk about what's going on there later. We actually did this study before the allocation of EHVs, before the pandemic. Or actually, we did the study with using data from before that period. We used it based on household level data, which really enabled us to see who got the vouchers from the housing authorities and how long did it take them to use the vouchers and at what rate did they ultimately succeed. It tended to take them a long time, more than 180 days, which is typically the amount of time that a housing authority gives somebody to use a voucher. And so why do we think people coming out of homelessness were able to succeed? Well, three things. One is people coming out, people trying to leave homelessness are very highly motivated to actually use their voucher.
Yeah.
It's not a surprise. The second thing is that a lot of people who got these prioritized vouchers from the housing authorities had case management. The case management was often paid for by the medical system. And we're pretty sure, although we have not done an intensive study of this, we're pretty sure that those case managers really helped people through the process, not only of getting their voucher from the housing authority, but then finding a willing landlord and being able to use the voucher. Yeah. And then a third thing is that Los Angeles, during this period, had some additional incentives for landlords, paid for by the county's own sources of revenue. So those are the three things that we think that combine to result in what we actually thought was a surprisingly high rate of ability to use those vouchers.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And you brought up Dallas. We really have a great partnership with our housing authority here in Dallas. They've been working really closely with us to try and get a larger preference for individuals exiting homelessness. So it's been a wonderful relationship that we've been building on, especially recently with some of the transformation that's happened here. Let's look at prevention. So the fourth question of your book, how do we prevent homelessness? Hits close to home with me. We have at United Way been doing a lot of work around the Federal Emergency Rental Assistance Program, trying to help keep people in their homes during this time of high evictions. And the fact that there hasn't been any research done on the distribution of cash assistance, like you talk about in your book around EFSP and HPRP, and now the ARPA dollars, because they've been pushed out into the communities so quickly. It's billions and billions of dollars that the federal government is spending, but really not looking into any kind of efficacy of those dollars, which is a little bit mind-blowing, right? I really, though, appreciate the deep dive that you did on some of the prevention strategies that do exist and do have good research behind them. But you talk about some problems that you found in programs that are designed to prevent homelessness. And I really enjoyed this chapter. I actually took a picture of this chapter and shared it with my rent assistance team. But you talk about worthiness. Can you talk a little bit about that and how you suggested to solve that problem?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so when we think about prevention, we can think about people who are on the verge of homelessness, and then we can think about how do we stop generating homelessness. So let's talk about people on the verge of homelessness. And we have strategies that work for those groups. Giving people housing vouchers is a great study also done by Apt Associates that looked at people who were on welfare, and those who got housing vouchers didn't become homeless, whereas a proportion of those who did not have access to the housing vouchers did. So the same kinds of subsidies that end homelessness prevent it. More modest things also work, but the trick here is really targeting. It's trying to find the people who are at greatest risk of homelessness. And homeless prevention programs often give their services to people who they deem worthy rather than people who are at greatest risk. So the most common kind of homelessness prevention is eviction prevention. And, one study that actually did look at this in Chicago found that indeed, if you give money to people who call up an eviction hotline, if they call up when money is available versus when money is not, they're less likely to become homeless. But only about 2% of those who called up when no money was available became homeless. And they reduced that down to 0.5%, huge reduction, 75% reduction by giving people money, but on a very low base, because most people who have leases from which they can be evicted are in better shape than people who don't have those. And the Chicago program, like many of these programs, required that people show that they were in crisis through no fault of their own. It was a one-time crisis, and that they'd be able to handle things again once they got a little help. Well, 98% of them could handle things again without a little help. And in New York, there's a program called Home Base, which is essentially good old-fashioned social work, backed up with a little bit of housing resources, actual money. And it's connecting people to everything that they're eligible for. And it works modestly to prevent homelessness. But when we did a study, we found that workers were asking a bunch of questions and then giving the services to people that, my terms, not theirs, were worthy. So they're more likely to give the services to high school graduates, but people who hadn't graduated were more likely to become homeless. They're more likely to give the services to people who were working, but people who weren't able to be working were more likely to become homeless. So the workers were erring in the direction of giving the services to worthiness rather than preventing homelessness. So you have to make a choice. Is the goal to reward worthiness, or is the goal to prevent homelessness?
Yeah, you can see that, like I said, in that rent assistance work that we've been doing, it's targeted to people who are unemployed, but then you get the pushback about, well, how are they going to maintain this rent once the assistance is gone? And then it starts getting into those questions around, shouldn't they have a job? Shouldn't we be funding those that do have a job? And it's quite the...
We found in the Home Base case that the services made the biggest difference for the people who were worst off.
Right.
And people who were on the verge of being able to manage by themselves didn't go to shelter. The services may have done useful things for needy people. And in a situation where we didn't have scarcity, it would be great to provide those services to everybody. So this issue of targeting only arises because there isn't enough to go around. But if there isn't enough to go around, you get the biggest bang for the buck by giving the services to the people who are the worst off.
Yes. So taking that, what is the best way that you all recommended to prevent homelessness, and why do you think we haven't adopted that solution?
Well, the closest thing we have to a silver bullet would be a massive expansion of the Housing Choice Voucher program. That's the program that gives long-term subsidies to people who are poor enough to qualify, and holds their housing costs to 30% of their income. And right now there's only enough funding for about 1 in 4 eligible households. So, if you're looking for a silver bullet, that's the closest thing we have. You'd need to supplement that for folks with serious mental illnesses and other kinds of disabilities with other kinds of services. But those folks need housing too.
Right. So let's take it out to a macro scale. Through the book, you make it very clear that homelessness is fundamentally the result of social policies that put housing out of the reach for many people, which you talked about along the day today. In your last chapter, you address what we as a society need to do to truly end homelessness in our nation. You say that to truly eradicate homelessness, we must address both the high costs of housing and deep poverty. Can you talk to us, just expand upon that for us?
Well, I think that silver bullet would go a long way, even without other changes to social policy. And so what we say is that you can work on the housing cost side of the problem, or you can work on the income side of the problem. And we go through a whole bunch of different elements of the social safety net in order to, to show that if you did, a whole bunch of different things on the income side, you could alleviate the deep poverty, which is keeping people from being able to afford housing unless they have a voucher, and would make it possible. I mean, we're probably not going to ever do enough on that side. I mean, we could expand the availability of TANF. We could expand, which is very little used really by people who are nominally eligible for it. And that's in a lot of parts of the country, particularly, my guess is your part. And we could expand SSI benefits, and we could, we could make unemployment insurance more generous. We could expand the SNAP subsidy levels. The food stamps are the closest thing that we have to a guaranteed income. We could also experiment with guaranteed incomes. A lot of communities across the country are beginning to do. We could increase, I think maybe I already mentioned, increasing SSI benefit levels. We could raise the minimum wage within reason. We could, and we could extend something that has been done on a temporary basis, unfortunately not made permanent, is to expand the child care tax credit. So, all of these things working on the, working on the income side would help. I mean, they would reduce the per unit cost of a voucher. During the presidential campaign in 2020 and early in the Biden administration, there was a lot of talk about a universal housing voucher program. That is to say, instead of available to only 1 in 4 people, it would be available to everybody who can use it or needs to use it. That actually doesn't mean you have to quadruple the size of the program. You really only need to double it. Because some people who are eligible, who are in poverty, don't stay in poverty for a long time. Some people would simply never take a subsidy. Some people wouldn't be able to use the subsidy. So, based on the assumption that we'd have to more or less double the size of housing assistance from the 5 million or so households who can get it now, we came up with a price tag of an additional $30 billion per year spent on federal housing assistance. It's a lot of money, but it's actually less than 1% of the federal budget. And it wouldn't have to, this policy would not have to be implemented all in 1 year. I mean, what we're thinking is that if you only added 200 or 300,000 units to the voucher program, to start, that would make a huge dent in the inflow into homelessness, because it would really sort of loosen up the system in which housing authorities were able to provide assistance to people who on the top of their waiting list, whether or not those were people who were experiencing homelessness. Yeah. And we started to talk about emergency housing vouchers. That's 70,000 additional vouchers across the country. But think of the fact that the Dallas-Fort Worth area only got about 750. I mean, that's not a lot. And this is a novel program. I think we have to, I saw a lot of different comments in the chat about difficulties that communities are having using EHVs. I think we have to remember that this is something brand new. I mean, requiring the collaboration between the COC and the housing authority, it has not been very easy for a lot of places to pull off. And so the program has been implemented and with various degrees of rapidity in different parts of the country. I saw a comment in the chat about Travis County. I interviewed a medium-sized city recently and asked about, their use of EHVs, and they basically used all their EHVs. It was hard. This is in a very high cost housing market, but the COC and the Housing Authority were in communication practically every day in order to troubleshoot for getting those EHVs used.
Wow.
And that city actually got a reallocation from HUD of additional EHVs.
What city was that again?
Santa Barbara.
Okay, interesting. We have to go study and learn more about how they did that.
Right.
I've seen like the chat keeps going about how difficult it has been to use vouchers here locally. Our state allows source of income discrimination, so we have a lot of landlords who just refuse. They just won't take them at all, and so it has been, especially in this market, really difficult for us to find those landlords that are willing to take the vouchers and work with us. Even with incentives and supportive services surrounding those folks. So it's, while we could say like we need to scale the voucher system, we also need to have a willingness for people, landlords, to accept them so that we can house people. So I want to kind of wrap up with my last question here, and then I'll hand it over to Jolie for some Q&A from the audience. But my favorite kind of final lines in your book, and I'm going to quote them back to you. Homelessness is a choice, not a choice by people sleeping on the streets, but a choice by the rest of us to look the other way. The United States is a wealthy country with both the resources and the knowledge to end homelessness, and what we need is the political will to do it. So what can those of us and those in our audience that are watching this do to help advocate for that change, and how can we choose differently?
That's a tough question.
Sorry.
And what we did is write a book. We say, can we pull together what we know and try to make the argument forcefully? But it's ultimately a political question, and we have to. And it's a political question at every level of government, right? We said the silver bullet would be the Housing Choice Voucher program. That's the federal level. We need to think about what localities can do, what states can do, what nonprofits can do. We all need to work together here. But most of the policy changes that would really make a difference are controlled by our political system. And we're a democracy, we vote. And so making these choices a piece of what you hold legislators and Congress people and presidents responsible for is one of the things that citizens can do.
I really enjoyed speaking with both of you today. I'm going to hand it back over to Jolie, who was able to join us so that we can do some Q&A. I'm happy to help with some of the things that are questions particularly about here locally, but I'm hopeful most of those questions are for you both. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Ashley. Thank you. This has been a tremendous conversation. The book was absolutely phenomenal. Thank you, everyone, for joining us out there virtually. We're going to take a little bit of time as we've been perusing the questions. Some of them have been answered by our panelists. I just have a few that I jotted down that I would love to tease out as well. Part of the work is also narrative change about who becomes homeless, why they become homeless. Like, it kind of wraps up some of the questions and comments about those perhaps that are experiencing a mental health crisis, or those percentages of those that are that are struggling with drug and alcohol addiction, anything like that. But there seems to be a resounding theme, even Ashley here locally in the work that we do, around the need for narrative change, or to humanize the who, the how, and the why of homelessness, because it's often inaccurate. Like those misconceptions that we have are often inaccurate. What are maybe 2 or 3 misconceptions? Like, I love to do myth and fact. Like, what are some of those myths that we hear about the who, the how, the why of homelessness, and some of those facts that your book not only seeks to debunk, but also Ashley and the work that you all have done and you continue to do as our COC chair that, you know, we're leaning into as well. So Dr. Jill, Dr. Mary Beth, either one of you would love to start.
One of the biggest myths is that people choose to be homeless. You know, they're out there because they want to be, and that relieves all the rest of us of responsibility, right? Because they want to be homeless. And that's just not the case. You know, if in Nashville, where I am, I mean, there's that myth that people want to be homeless. When you go to an encampment and say, you know, well, you know, we can put you on a coordinated entry list and we can ask you a bunch of questions and, you know, maybe eventually there'll be some resources for you. People say, hey, I just want to be homeless. As soon as you start actually getting people from that encampment into housing, everybody's online for that housing. If it's a credible offer of housing, people want it. And so it's not a choice. That's myth number one. I'll let Jill pick a different one.
Well,
I'll keep going if you like.
Well, I'll keep going on that myth. I mean, when, you know, in this new program during the pandemic that offered people, sometimes it was depending on the community, sometimes it was people in shelters, often it was people on the street, offered them basically a hotel room. People were, you know, with a fair amount of privacy and autonomy, and usually they could go with their spouse or take their pets. I mean, people were absolutely delighted to leave congregate shelters or to leave the streets and go stay in a place where they could take a shower, in you know, a place where they had some place to put their possessions. I mean, you know, I mean, that is further that is further evidence. And, you know, this is pretty systematic evidence from some places. There was a study done by, maybe, you know, you had Greg Colburn on for an earlier one of these seminars, and he did a very good study in Seattle of the way in which Project Room Key or whatever it was called there was worked for, you know, so that's another piece of evidence debunking the idea that people actually choose to be homeless. People often do not want to go into a shelter because shelters can be dangerous. They can throw you out during the day. They can make you stand in line to sign in at night, and therefore, if you're working, you can't keep a job. Or you can't bring your pets, you have to be separated from your spouse, and so on and so forth. So, you know, so people often choose to stay on the street rather than going into shelter, but that doesn't mean they actually want to be homeless. That just means that they don't have an alternative.
And somebody in the chat just said how important is dignity, and absolutely. I mean, having your private space, having control over your space, having autonomy in your space is important to people, and those are all taken away from you in a shelter. And people sometimes get a vestige of that in encampments, but a home where you can lock the door and you decide who comes in is the foundation of dignity.
And it's the foundation of housing first, which Beth talked about earlier.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you. Ashley, anything you would like to add?
No, I mean, I just love that they hit on the fact that people don't they're not wanting to live in tents on the streets. It's the avoidance of the shelter that they're doing. That I think that's one of the biggest myths that exists out there that I hope people go away with learning that it's not. They want that independence. They want the dignity any way that they can get it. And that's how they can get it.
Another myth that came up in the Q&A is, you know, it's all mental illness. And as I said earlier, you know, why should the penalty for mental illness be homelessness? Most people who experience mental illness are not homeless, but SSI and SSDI benefits are not enough to pay the rent. So if that's all you got, you're not going to be able to pay the rent. But we should go back to a point we made earlier that many more people experience homelessness over a period of time than are homeless on a single night. And so people who are homeless on a single night, people who have difficulty extricating themselves from homelessness kind of mount up in the system. People who can get out fairly readily do so. And the people who are left are more likely to have various kinds of disabilities. And mental illness is one of those, and it's the one that's talked about the most, but there are various kinds of brain injuries, and there are physical disabilities. There are a lot of disabilities that make it harder for people to earn a living and to earn enough to afford the rent. So people with mental illness and other disabilities are at higher risk because we don't have an adequate safety net.
I also talk about, when I'm having this conversation of being unhoused is traumatic, right? It can exacerbate conditions that if you were housed with a proper safety net, with a proper, with a circle of friends and family that were able to say, help support you, living outside in the elements is a traumatic experience that often exacerbates conditions that may not have even been experienced in its full blossom in a different setting.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of people don't hit the bottle until after they hit the street. And what we found in the family option study, this big study where we randomized over 2,200 families to different housing and service options, is that when families got access to housing vouchers, it not only resolved homelessness, but psychological distress went down, substance abuse went down, domestic violence went down, food insecurity went down, kids' school attendance improved. All kinds of problems that can sometimes lead to homelessness were reduced when families just got housing that they could afford.
Right. Well, I was going to say too, how many addicts live around us and amongst us that aren't homeless, right? Like, it's
I'm a college professor, and so I can let you on a secret that a lot of college students abuse substances. And nobody ever says that they became college students because of their substance use.
I love that. I love that.
Amazing.
You all talked about the silver bullet, right? Housing choice voucher. Housing is the solution for homelessness. We talked about that. Some of what I saw in the Q&A talks about some of these systems that increase an individual's propensity, right? Whether it be criminal justice system, the healthcare, or lack of education, whatever the case is. Sometimes I pose it, and I would love to get your thoughts. I pose it this way: we can invest on the front end, right, of some of these systems, or the back end, which may be the response to homelessness, or encampment decommissioning, or increasing shelter capacity. Give me any thoughts that you have, even Ashley, when it comes from the space that you're in about rental assistance, or eviction, helping with people, preventing those evictions, the investments that we have to be willing to make through policy, through individual action on the front end versus the back end. Any thoughts you all have to share?
We certainly do a lot of things that make it worse. So our incarceration rates, highest in the world, and way disproportionately visited on African Americans and other people of color, make it much harder for people who are coming out of prison to find housing. And indeed, we have rules that say, and those rules, partly, a few of them are set at the federal level, a lot of them are set more locally, say, well, people with certain kinds of criminal backgrounds on their records can't move into housing. And if their family's in housing, they can't join their family because the family will get kicked out. So you have to choose between dad and housing. So there's certainly a lot of things that we do to make things worse that we could do to create a different kind of society that would not yield up as many people to
and another thing that we talk about is the is the way that the job market works for the lowest income people. You know, so many people out there, they don't know what their schedule is going to be, because, you know, they work in the fast food industry, or they work in other industries in which, you know, they basically are offered an opportunity to work a certain number of hours a week, or maybe not, that's not even regular, but they're given a schedule at the last minute. I mean, if they have childcare responsibilities, or if they're taking care of an elder, you know, how are they going to juggle their life responsibilities with going to work? And so I think another area that we could be working on is the stability of employment. And you know, even before you get to the issue of whether wages are high enough and what to do about that, but just having the employment work in a much more rational way, in a way that doesn't punish low-income people, would be another way that we could work on prevention.
But, and I said this early on too in COVID, when we were working in the rental assistance and the eviction space, but if you looked at the way just the federal government responded with the assistance that they put out there, there was better assistance provided for folks who owned a home versus those that were renting a home. Mm-hmm. So even just that, those small things which people don't really pay much attention to, mm-hmm. that even that right there, that systemic, I mean, racism, if you look at who are the main mm-hmm. people who rent in our country, mm-hmm. is a cause of what we're seeing, you know, just falls down the line to end up in homelessness, right? So,
and that's part of the tax structure too.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, if you're a homeowner, you can deduct the interest that you pay on your mortgage up to a limit now, but pretty high limit, from your income. And so you don't pay taxes on that. There's nothing equivalent for renters.
Right.
Absolutely. I appreciate this. I have to give a shout out. We have an amazing community partner, Child Poverty Action Lab. They just did a tremendous study about the housing choice voucher, what it looks like for us. We know in this space, our homeless response system, vouchers and the acceptance of vouchers is critically important, especially when we're thinking about moving individuals into perhaps high opportunity areas or just into a home. Mm-hmm. And so the work that they did, to you both, and they just released it yesterday, it showed even in our city, our county, Dallas County, where housing choice vouchers were being accepted and where they were not, right? Mm-hmm. Even some of the myths that might need to be changed about the extensive paperwork. Now we know that our housing authority has done a tremendous job of streamlining the process for housing choice voucher. Anything else regarding the truths about how helpful housing choice vouchers would be, but also should that be the only solution we have, knowing that a huge percent of individuals are needing to heavily rely on housing choice vouchers? That seems to be an indication of our system as well.
Yeah, well, that's why we say, you know, housing affordability is a joint function of income and housing costs. There are lots of things we can do to support incomes and the regularity of incomes. There are lots of things we can do to bring down housing costs. We probably need an all of the above kind of approach.
I mean, the expansion of the child tax credit as an emergency response to the public health crisis associated with COVID-19 was, I mean, very important in raising a lot of children out of poverty. And we even think that one of the reasons that why the numbers of families with children in shelter went down during the pandemic was because that one measure was extremely helpful in averting the crises that tip families into homelessness. Obviously, there were a lot of other things going on. Some families may have simply figured out how to avoid taking their kids into shelter during a public health crisis. But it was quite striking to me that this was more of a, you know, the drop in the occupancy, or the drop in the numbers, was much greater for families with kids than it was for individuals. And we think that that has to do with the fact that a lot of the stronger safety net measures that were enacted temporarily during the pandemic were more likely to apply to families than they were to apply to individuals experiencing homelessness.
Absolutely. Any final thoughts as we are about to wrap up and say our goodbyes? Ashley, thank you for being a fantastic facilitator. Dr. Mary Beth Shin, Dr. Jill Kaduri, thank you so much for the tremendous work. And the book was phenomenal. It was great to read and to learn so much. I have literally highlighted and taken notes, and I've been scratching on my scratch sheet of paper here on the side as well. Any final comments, anything you want to lift up, Ashley, even for you during this time in facilitation, your work as the COC chair, and then Dr. Mary Beth and Dr. Jill?
No, I just want to add to your thank yous. The book was amazing. I really enjoyed reading it and learning from you both, and also highlighted all throughout the book and took lots of notes. So thank you both for coming and speaking with us today. It's an honor to meet you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Thanks so much for having us.
And
Appreciate it.
thanks for all the work that you're doing.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Anyone out there, please do not hesitate. There's a lot of service providers, direct service providers. There's a lot of us working in this system here locally, and they are doing a tremendous amount of work within this space. Thank you for joining us for today's hard conversation. Thank you to our panelists again and our facilitator. I'm going to tease like our final hard conversation of the year. Part of the work that we do that we want to continue to stay centered on is centering the voices of those with lived experience. I went to a conference about a month ago, and they were using the vernacular lived expertise, and I absolutely love it. And so our final hard conversation of 2022, it's going to take place in October. The date and information will come to you, but we are going to be, in our effort to continue to center those with lived experience, that will be an opportunity for us to hear from those that have experience with being one of our unhoused neighbors. And so I am looking forward to that conversation. As many places as we continue to loop in and bring in those with lived experience, we will definitely try to do that. Thank you to all of our attendees that joined us in this virtual space. You are greatly appreciated, and all of you in the work that you do across our continuum. And I even saw some folks that are outside of the state. So I appreciate you. I hope you all have a great rest of your day and week. Have a good one.